There's been this one lens that I've had my eye on for a long time, like over a year, and I just haven't pulled the trigger on it. I just kind of felt like I was doing a good job with my work and I didn't really need it, and I was trying to justify not spending the money on this lens because it's not cheap. But after sitting on it for way too long, I finally dropped the money and picked up this Tamron 35 to 150 mil f2 to 2.8, and boy, do I have a lot of thoughts about it. One of the things that I find myself struggling the most with when I'm filming sports videos is getting shots at different focal lengths quickly and easily without fussing around with changing lenses all the time, which is why you probably saw in one of my most recent videos that I bring like 3 different camera setups with 3 different lenses on them to go film one football game. And that works for me, but I'm sure you can understand with that why having a lens like this that has a really wide focal range and a really fast aperture throughout the lens is really appealing to me. The fact that this lens is also weather sealed makes it even more enticing for me because I do film football games outside a lot and sometimes I get caught in less than ideal weather, and knowing that this lens can stand up to that kind of makes it perfect for me. Now I do want to test this thing out right away, so we're going to actually film a basketball game today for the Canadian Elite Basketball League, which is actually where I used to work, but I'm going back out to help them out today, and we're going to put this lens to the test. I'm only going to bring this lens and this camera right here that I'm filming on, the Sony FX30, and we're going to see if I can film a full basketball game effectively with this camera and lens combo to see if this really is the only lens you need in your kit to film sports and action videos effectively. Now, before we actually go to the game, there are some features of this lens that I want to talk about because I observed them right out of the box and I think that they're important to note. First off, this lens is very, very heavy, like noticeably heavier than my other Tamron zoom lens, the 28 to 75. And honestly, it doesn't feel like there's much of a weight difference between this lens and the Sony 70-200 f4 that I use. This lens weighs a whopping 1,162 grams, which is a ton of weight, but that also contributes to a really solid feeling build quality and a lens that I'm confident to hold in my hand and I feel like wouldn't just crack on me if I were to drop it. Not that I want to do that. Also, this lens has an external zoom, so you can see when I zoom it here, it kind of goes out and then comes back in, and it also comes with a lock so that if I want to, I can lock it and then it doesn't zoom, and I can unlock it and it zooms. And this makes it smaller to store in your bag than the 70-200 millimeter f4, the Mark I, that doesn't have an extended zoom, but just is really long all the time and is kind of cumbersome to carry around in your bag. And as much as I love that lens, that's kind of been like the one thing about it that I've loved the least. So this solves that issue. You can see all 3 of these lenses on the screen right now: the Tamron 28 to 75 millimeter f2.8, the Sony 70-200 millimeter f4 Mark I, and the Tamron 35 to 150 millimeter f2 to 2.8. I'm going to show you their length extended out so you can compare all of them. And I should also note that the zoom ring on this lens is quite stiff. Maybe this is something that's going to loosen up over time, but for now, like, it's kind of a challenge to bring it around all the way, and I don't think this is a really effective lens for crash zooming if that's something you're into. But hey, maybe that's a good thing if you have a bad habit of just cranking your zoom when you have to get to a different focal length. I don't know, but just something to make note of. I'm hoping that this gets a little bit looser over time. Also, I thought this was really interesting. This lens zooms in the same direction as your native Sony lenses, so there's nothing to get used to there. But unlike the 28 to 75 from Tamron, the zoom ring on this lens is closer to the camera body, and on the 28 to 75, the zoom ring is closer to the front of the lens, with the focus ring being closer to the camera body, which is an interesting design choice, I guess. I don't know why they would just switch those on 2 lenses from the same brand and similar focal ranges. I'm hoping there's some sort of logical reason for this, but I feel like if my brain is working on autopilot, at least at the start, I may just grab the focus ring and pull it and mess my focus up and not zoom in or zoom out when I need to. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen today. But like this is a small thing, I'm sure I can get used to this pretty quickly. This Tamron 35-150 f2-2.8 also has Tamron's new VXD focusing system for improved autofocus. Unlike their old RXD system, which by the way was still perfectly fine, I used both Tamron 28-75 lenses, the old one with the RXD system and the new one with the VXD system, with multiple Sony mirrorless cameras over the years, and can confirm that they've all performed great when using autofocus, so I expect the autofocus on this lens to be superb. Now look, this information is all important, but at the end of the day, these are all paper specs that we're talking about, and I think we're going to learn a lot more about the usability of this lens by actually bringing it out into the field and using it on a job. So let's go out and use it and see if it's actually viable to have this lens be the only lens in your kit.
Yeah. All of you, none of me. You can bet 100 at a time that I'm in the blues. Learn how to live amongst the animals on front of zoo. Said he got a plug on the merch, told him send it through. Lately I've been looking at them prawns like they minuscule. Ooh, hold on, gotta see it through. I might hold a sword or the Drake. I got different views. We can't even go out on the walk. We got different shoes. Told you I was supposed to stop, but I ain't get the news. Look, I was on the block, now I'm on the clock. Used to push a mop, now I'm on the shop. Look, put me in the box, I can't let it rock. Number one pick, I can't let them crop. Yeah. I just linked with the Brody, time to sharpen up. Man, the whole gang get a life to a carpet. They say, how your life going? I say, marvelous. Yeah, they ain't tryna wait till they do it. It's gonna start with us. I said, well done, like it's ready. I've been with the Saints like I'm ready. You just say the word, then I'm ready. I just hit the dash, look, ready. We gon' take a L, I can't imagine. We gon' send him packing. Should've went to school, but he was trapping. Used to have them creases in the khakis. Never seen the precinct, must've been that prayer and that fasting. You are not my twin, it ain't no matching us. I stand on the 3, I got a shot and I can't pass it up.
I had the opportunity, obviously, to film that basketball game that we were just at, and in addition to that, I also had a last-minute opportunity come up to film a wedding, which is not something that I'm normally a fan of. I don't really do that type of thing. But I thought it was another versatile environment where I could use, I almost grabbed my water bottle because it's also black, where I could use this lens and really test out its usability across different environments. And the first thing I have to say about this lens, and we're going to kind of talk about my general thoughts on this lens and its performance and its usability first, and then we'll talk about scenario-specific stuff second. But my first thoughts were that this lens is awesome. Like the aperture, being able to have f2.8 all the way through at this focal length, as I've already talked about, is amazing. I know I'm going on about it, but it's fantastic. And I shot with this lens stopped down to f2.8 throughout, so even at the wider end where you can shoot at f2, f2.2, or f2.5, I was still shooting at f2.8, and overall, very happy with those results. Now, autofocus is one of the most important factors in a lens in the modern day, and I definitely have some takeaways about the autofocus performance of this lens. Overall, I'm going to say the autofocus performance was pretty good. The one scenario I noticed this lens struggle in a little bit when it came to autofocus was when a subject is coming at you, it wasn't always the best at tracking the subject as they came towards you, and when you're filming a basketball game, sometimes a subject can come towards you very quickly, and sometimes in those situations, I would lose focus a little bit. But for the most part, it was pretty good, definitely usable in a sporting environment. Not the best I've ever seen, but not the worst either. I did also have this one issue when I was filming the wedding where I would focus by half pressing the shutter button on my camera, and it would give me the little square around the subject's eye, but then focus on the background for some reason, even though the camera was saying that it was focused on the person. So I'm not sure if this is like a camera specific thing, if it has to do with the camera with this lens in a particular mode or what the deal was there, but it only happened sometimes. It kind of just stopped after. It seemed like a weird quirk or something, but I'm not really sure what to make of that, but it's important to note because like it happened in testing. I should also note that I had no issues with sharpness in this lens. This lens is pretty sharp throughout. All my images looked good. I had no complaints. Now, with regards to focus, I should note that focus breathing compensation, which is available on a lot of Sony cameras nowadays, is not on this lens. Obviously, this is a Tamron lens, which is third party, and focus breathing compensation is only supported by native Sony lenses. But I didn't notice any issues with focus breathing. I've definitely had some lenses in the past, like the 90mm macro G Master, which was notorious for really noticeable focus breathing, and that's not an issue on this lens, so very happy to report that. The one thing with regard to focus that isn't super hot on this lens is the minimum focusing distance. I'm pretty sure the minimum focusing distance on this lens is 1/3 of a meter, and I definitely noticed when I was using it that if a subject got too close to me, which was like not that often, that I wasn't able to focus on the subject and I would have to take a small step back or wait for them to move a little bit further away from me. Now, most of the time you don't get a subject that close to your lens when you're filming sports or events or anything of that nature, but it did happen once or twice, and look, it wasn't the biggest deal in the world, but this is definitely no macro type of lens like that new 70-200 f4 Mark II macro from Sony that just came out. This is not going to be able to do what that lens is going to be able to do in terms of close focusing or macro reproduction. Now, something about the Tamron 35-150 f2-2.8 that really surprised me pleasantly was the parfocalness. This lens is surprisingly parfocal, and like not perfect. It's not advertised as being a perfectly parfocal lens, but it's pretty dang good. I feel pretty confident zooming in with manual focus, focusing on a subject, zooming out back to 35mm and knowing that my image is going to be pretty sharp. Maybe I'll have to make a small adjustment in focus, but for the most part, my focus stays at the same place. And if I do have to make a small adjustment in focus, it's really easy to do so because the focus throw on this lens is really long, like almost 180 degrees type of long. So if I need to make a fine-tune adjustment, I'm not going to overcompensate by tweaking the focus ring just a little bit. I can usually make it with peaking enabled on my camera, and I'm just fine. Now, with regards to the long focus throw, obviously that's not something that's necessarily ideal, but you can make adjustments to your focus direction, like the way you pull focus. I'm pretty sure the focus distance as well. And you can even set up an A to B focus pull using a custom button in the Tamron utility app. You just plug this lens in via this USB-C port right here to your camera and download the Tamron lens utility software, and you can make all these adjustments to your camera to make the focusing and like how you want, and set up all these custom buttons, because there's 1, 2, 3 custom buttons on this camera. Ow. Now, when I was filming this basketball game, there was a bit of flaring. There are some kind of harsh lights that I found myself sometimes pointing the lens up at and right into, and the flare control on this lens is pretty passable. Not perfect, but I would say it looks pleasing, and you can reduce the flares that come into this lens with this lens hood, which is provided with the lens. Overall, I wouldn't say that the flares are an issue. You're not going to point this lens at a light and get your image completely washed out. The contrast reduction, I guess, is actually pretty nice, and I find that it kind of looks like artsy and good when you point this lens at a flare, even though the flare is still very much noticeable. Now, as far as usability for sports, I had actually filmed at this venue previously in a YouTube video that I had done previously on this channel that you can check out up here. So I knew that this venue is kind of small. The lighting isn't great, definitely not what you would expect for a professional level venue. And as I said, I shot everything at f2.8 and I used a 180-degree shutter angle. I filmed in 24 frames per second, 60 frames per second, and 120 frames per second. And I'm happy to report that this lens definitely held up, even with the lighting not being at par for what you'd expect. It looked more like a high school gym than a professional gym. But I think that even with that, my images from this time filming at that venue using this lens looked better than my images from the last time I filmed at that venue using a combination of the Tamron 28-75 f2.8 and the Sony 70-200mm f4 Mark I. Now, one of the biggest factors to consider with this lens, and this is probably the thing that's going to determine when you use this lens and when you opt to go for something else, or what video modes you film in with this lens on your camera, is the crop factor. And this is going to get a little bit numbers heavy, so I have some notes here that I'm going to refer to every once in a while. But like I said, I filmed action in 24, 60, and 120 frames per second using the Sony FX30. Now in 24 frames per second, all we're getting is that 1.5 times crop that you get from a crop sensor like the Sony FX30, which turned this 35 to 150 into a 52 to 225 millimeter lens, which when you think about it, a 52 to 225 with an f2 to 2.8 aperture is pretty remarkable for like almost any environment. If you're going to be filming in 24 frames per second, putting this lens on a crop sensor and having a 52 to 225 millimeter lens is kind of amazing for really any type of event environment. It's super versatile, so I was really happy with that. And then on the FX30 filming in 4K 60, you're only getting an additional 1.04 times crop on top of this crop you already have on your crop sensor, which essentially means that there's barely a difference. Maybe you have to take a half step back or your shot's going to be a tiny bit tighter, but it means that you can basically have like a 50 to 225 filming all the way up to 4K 60 on the FX30, a crop sensor, fairly affordable camera for what you're getting relative to the price of other Sony mirrorless and low-end cinema cameras. It's kind of a great bang for your buck for anyone who's looking to film sports in a professional setting. Now, where things get a little bit tricky is filming in 4K 120, because you're taking that 52 to 225 millimeter lens that you have with the crop sensor and adding an additional 1.56 times crop onto that, which for sports like football or soccer is really nice, but for a sport like basketball, you're now filming with an 81 to 351 millimeter lens, so let's just call that like an 80 to 350 mil, which presented some challenges in my particular environment filming basketball. Sometimes I'd be filming in 4K 120 and taking advantage of that extra reach to film action across the court, or get a really tight shot of a player shooting a three, following the ball into the net and getting a close-up of the ball going through. But then the player would drive into the paint and I'd be nearly under the basket. They'd be a couple feet away from me, and the furthest I'd be able to zoom out is 80 mil. Or there'd be a play in transition, players would be running at me. I would zoom out to 80 mil because that's what my crop allowed, but it wasn't really wide enough for me to make sense of the action and get a good shot, and I ended up blowing a couple shots that way, which was a little bit disappointing. So for basketball particularly, I wouldn't film in 4K 120 on a crop sensor camera like the FX30 using this lens, but if you have a full frame camera like this A7 IV or the FX3, or really any other full frame camera, then I think this can be a great option for that. Now to wrap things up here, I think the Tamron 35 to 150 mil is a great option for filming sports or essentially any other run and gun type of environment. If you can deal with the very hefty weight, understand how this lens is going to work with your camera of choice, and justify the price tag, then it's a fast, sharp, reliable option with decent autofocus that can get the job done pretty much in any environment. Now, do I think that this Tamron 35 to 150 can be the only lens in your kit? I think that depends on what you're doing and your specific environment and the cameras that you're using alongside of it. For me, I need the additional reach of a crop sensor if I'm going to go film football on a large Canadian football field, and can even take advantage of that additional crop in 4K 120, but then I can film in 24 or 60 frames per second on a crop sensor, or get even wider by using a full frame camera to make this lens kind of work for me in any environment. So that's going to be all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to the channel because I post videography and video editing tips and tutorial videos similar to this one on a regular basis. Also, if you liked the way that my basketball footage looked in this video, I color it using my sports video LUT pack, which is what I use for any type of indoor or court sports. That's how I do all my color grading. And when I'm filming football or any outdoor sports that are played on grass, I use my football video LUT pack, which is optimized to preserve those greens while making skin tones pop and your footage look good. Those are all available on my website, www.petersarellas.com, so please go check them out. If you have any questions, drop them in a comment down below. A lot of people will DM me on Instagram asking me follow-up questions to my videos, and it's much nicer to just have everything down below so that we can all help each other out and we don't get the same question being asked a bunch of times, because honestly, I just can't get to everything and I want to make sure that I'm helping out as many people as possible. Anyways, that's going to be all for this video. So until next time, peace.